linguists in general are of the consensus opinion that the human brain does not work by what you can call series thinking. That is, your thinking is logical in a series versus parallel thinking, where you're considering all options at the same time. So they talk about, rather than thinking in series, that the first thing that your brain does is it goes to the dictionary definition of the literal interpretation, and when you eliminate that as a possible option, then you start considering metaphorical uh, considerations. Rather than working that way, uh, what the brain does is it considers all options simultaneously, all options that at least are accessible to the person's intellect. As you grow and get older, there are more and more options in terms of the meaning of words that come into your encyclopedic entry. So the options grow and change and expand over time. And they've done experiments, using flashcards and things. But most interesting is they've hooked people up to electrode things on their brain and mapped what happens to the brain when they get verbal stimulus. And what happens is, when they are given a word or a phrase, the whole brain lights up simultaneously with all of the options. And then as they're provided context, the lights, the brain activity is represented by lights on the screen. The lights all go out and narrow down to like a little specific area where they've the individual has figured out what the meaning of the word is. Now, this all happens, usually at the speed of light, um, because we do it intuitively, and our brains function literally at this, at light, at well, the speed of electricity. Um, Now, that means that in a context like the modern world, where we share a lot in common, we sort of intuitively sort through language, whether it's literal or metaphorical, just automatically by instinct. But what happens when you separate the audience from the text, like the Bible, with a 2 to 3,000 year gap? And a gap that is not only chronologically that wide, but culturally is quite different. The living in the world of the ancient Near East had a lot of different assumptions about economics and politics and religion, not to mention our worldview of the physical universe. A lot of different assumptions. And so what happens is, we moderns read these ancient texts, and we read it with our encyclopedic entries, and it, we realize, though, that there's this gap there. And so we don't read the text as intuitively as the original audience would have. And so we end up sort of by necessity, sometimes we have to process things uh, a little more mechanically and a little more in series, because we're trying to figure it out, because it's a foreign situation. So the goal of interpretation is not only to know the grammar of the language, as I mentioned, but we have to understand the cultural background as best we can. And to the degree that we can map our brains, or actually map the brain of the ancient person over to our mindset, to the extent that we can do that, it trains our instincts to make these, instant judgment decisions about, is it literal or metaphorical. And most languages is actually metaphorical. And in people, the studies that they've done in the lab, asking people to respond to the meaning of a word that's flashed in front of them, by default, they actually will go to a metaphorical meaning before a literal one. Why is that? Relevance theory tells us, because as human beings, as creatures, we want to maximize the benefit that we expend our resources on. So our bodies are wonderfully created machines to our bodies are working correctly, we optimally utilize the nutrition that we give it for where it's needed the most, and we get rid of the waste, that trivia that's not relevant. And and we operate the same way really in our language, that we are looking to get the most benefit out of whatever the other person is telling us. And uh, getting my brain is starting to wander here. Uh, yeah. What we want to do is to have our brains in tune with the way that an ancient person would have optimized the communication situation. And very often, most of the time, you will default to a metaphor, because in a metaphor there's more benefit, more cognitive. That's where I was going with this. There's more cognitive benefit in a metaphorical use of language. That's why poetry is so powerful, and the Bible is replete with poetry. Whenever God speaks, He speaks in poetry in the Old Testament. Why? Because, sort of pound for pound, if you will, figurative language carries a better cognitive benefit, a better payoff for us. It packs a heavier punch. So, unlike what you commented on, and I was taught that as a first year seminary student, that literal sense is the way we go unless it makes no sense. That's a wrong, um, a wrong uh, axiom to use for not just Bible interpretation, but trying to function in life.